I'm writing this with hands that still shake when I remember that night. 6 months have passed since January 4th, 2025, yet the sound of deliberate claws scraping across aluminum still wakes me at 3 a.m. in our downtown Austin penthouse. My wife, Jenny, refuses to let me talk about what happened in the East Texas mountains. She believes that silence might keep it from finding us again, but quiet has its own sharp edges, and neither of us sleeps. 3 days ago, a headline punched the breath out of me. 2 hikers missing in Sabine National Forest, the same place where we barely escaped with our lives. Authorities ended the search after a week, presumed lost to exposure, the report said. But I know better. I know what's waiting inside those ancient pines, something that collects memories the way a predator collects bones. Back then, I was Jeffrey Dawson, 42, an investment banker whose life was built on probability charts and market logic. Monsters belonged in movies, not in spreadsheets. Success meant a penthouse view matching BMWs and a calendar so crowded it felt like another lock around my throat. Jenny and I needed a pause, a breath outside the noise, a chance to remember who we were before ambition turned us into silhouettes behind office glass. So we chose an RV getaway for New Year's weekend. I rented 30-foot Winnebago lumbering toward Pine Ridge RV Resort, if resort is the word for a gravel clearing 40 miles from the nearest town. The owner's voice on the phone was slow and moss-covered. He promised January would be quiet. We wanted solitude. We got something else entirely. The drive wound through green tunnels of pine and oak. Jenny navigated with the GPS muted, her phone sealed in the glove box like a bad habit. When we finally parked at Site 23, the forest closed around us like a cathedral of dark spires. Only one neighbor sat a quarter-mile away. Perfect isolation. The first 2 days were almost holy. We hiked paths where the air tasted of cold sap and iron. Jenny pocketed pine cones like small planets, laughing when their resin stuck to her fingers. We grilled steaks, uncorked a bottle of wine meant for some future celebration, and talked about the children we'd been trying to have, dreams that had begun to feel like financial forecasts instead of life. For a moment, we believed this trip might heal the frayed threads between us. Then we found the footprints. We were following a narrow game trail when I saw them. Depressions in the wet earth, each print twice the length of my size 11 boot, spaced for a stride no ordinary creature could match. The soil held their weight like memory foam deep, clean, undeniable. Jenny crouched to study them, her scientific mind searching for explanations, but even she couldn't fit them into the world we knew. Maybe a bear, she whispered, but her voice tilted upward at the end, more question than answer. As we turned back, a slow-forming pressure crawled across my shoulders, the kind of tension you feel when someone stands too close behind you. I kept scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the sensation traveled with us, a presence stitched into the dusk. New Year's Eve arrived clear and sharp, the air cold enough to etch our breath into small ghosts. We lit a few roadside fireworks, Roman candles, bottle rockets, a single mortar shell that climbed high before bursting in a fountain of gold. For an instant, the forest became daylight, every trunk and branch flashing into stark relief. Jenny's laughter floated up with the sparks, and for a heartbeat I thought we'd reclaimed something we'd lost. But when the last echo faded, the woods didn't return to normal. They fell into a quiet so dense it felt shaped, like a dome lowering over us. Even the insects withheld their usual night music. We retreated to the RV, tipsy and happy, and tried to ignore how the silence pressed against the windows. Morning brought coffee and a silence that tasted different, thick, metallic, like air before a thunderclap. No bird calls, no rustle of squirrels. Just a waiting stillness that made the hairs on my arms rise. Jenny blamed the cold front. I wanted to believe her. Later, while exploring a trail near the strange footprints, we discovered stone markers, stacks of granite 3 feet high, arranged in a perfect ring that, if mapped from above, would have circled our campsite. Each cairn held small offerings, bird bones, scraps of cloth, even a single weather-beaten hiking boot with the tongue ripped out as if bitten. The stones were balanced too carefully to be chance, too old to be an art project. Something had built them, and whatever it was, it wanted its message understood. That night, the forest exhaled a new kind of darkness. Around midnight, a single, heavy thud struck the RV wall so strong the cabinets rattled and the mattress shivered beneath us. Jenny sat bolt upright. Another impact followed, then a slow sequence of footsteps. Not the light, scattered steps of deer or raccoon. These were weighted, deliberate, each one a small earthquake, an invisible hammer pacing the perimeter of our thin metal shell. We clutched each other, barely breathing. Outside, the footsteps paused. A shadow passed our bedroom window, wide enough to blot the stars. Then came the sound that will follow me to the grave. A long, deliberate scrape, metal against metal, claws or fingers testing the siding with a patience that felt almost human. The scratching drifted from window to window, as if the thing outside were reading our defenses like Braille. Every few seconds it stopped, listening. I could hear its breathing, deep, slow, controlled. Not the pant of an animal, but the measured inhale of something evaluating. Minutes stretched into an hour. When the footsteps finally retreated, the forest swallowed the sound completely. We stayed frozen until the first light bled through the curtains. Our muscles cramped, our hearts unwilling to slow. Stepping outside was worse. 2 of the RV's tires had been ripped open, not slashed, but peeled apart in neat, terrifying spirals. The rims were scored with deep gouges, as if some enormous hand had pinched and twisted them. Fresh prints surrounded the site, huge and unmistakable, their edges sharp in the morning frost. They were too long for any human, too precise for any bear, and embedded in the deepest track were ridged patterns like fingerprints, magnified to nightmare scale. We had 1 spare tire, no signal, 40 miles of wilderness between us and the nearest town. Jenny's face drained of color. I tried to speak calmly, to plan, but my thoughts scattered like frightened birds. Whatever had come in the night hadn't merely visited, it had disabled us. It had made a choice. The door hung half open, breathing cold into the RV while we held our own breath like fugitives inside a lung of metal. Moonlight caught the torn weather strip and made it glisten as though the night itself were bleeding through. I raised the extinguisher higher, but the shadow in the doorway did not advance. It simply occupied the space, tall enough that its outline pressed against the frame like a tree trunk trying on the shape of a man. A sound followed, soft, deliberate, something between a rumble and a purr, as if a distant engine were idling inside a chest. the size of a wardrobe. Jenny's fingers found mine and locked there, damp and ice cold. We waited for the final shove that never came. Instead, a single arm, or what my eyes insisted was an arm, slid inward. Not fur, not skin, but a texture I still can't name. Dark and uneven, glinting where the moon touched it, like bark slick with rain. The hand, if you could call it, that hovered just above the floor, massive and oddly graceful. Long, ridged fingers traced the threshold, stopping inches from the latch as though memorizing the space. Then, with a motion so slow it felt almost ceremonial, the hand withdrew. The door drifted closed without a sound. For a full minute, nothing moved. The silence outside deepened until I could hear the electricity in the refrigerator coils trying to decide whether to die. Jenny whispered, "Did it just leave?" Her voice cracked on the last word, an audible question mark in the dark. I didn't answer. I was listening past the hum, past the frantic beat of my own heart for footsteps. Instead, I heard something stranger, a low sequence of knocks on the RV's siding. 3 slow taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 1 tap. It was the same pattern from the window earlier, now played like a code against metal. Each strike carried a weight that traveled through the floor into my bones. When it ended, the forest swallowed every trace of it. Then came the smell. It seeped through the seams like a tide of damp iron and mossy earth, thick enough that I tasted it on my tongue. It wasn't rot. It was older, more mineral like a cave that's never known sunlight. Jenny pressed her sleeve to her face and shook. A sudden gust, no, a force swept around the RV, rocking us just once, as though the entire forest exhaled in a single push. Lights flickered and steadied. Then nothing. Minutes stretched into hours. We didn't speak. At some point, exhaustion pinned us where we sat, our backs against the kitchenette, eyes fixed on the door's crooked seam. Sleep was impossible, but time blurred anyway. Gray seeped through the curtains at last. Dawn's first light fell like a verdict. I eased the door open with the caution of someone testing thin ice. Outside, the world looked ordinary, which made it worse. Frost glittered on pine needles. Our overturned sedan lay silent, roof crushed into a frozen puddle. But fresh impressions circled the RV, enormous prints pressed deep into the soil, each one holding a thin sheen of ice like a mirror. In the center of the clearing, something new waited, an arrangement of stones, taller than my waist, stacked in a narrow spiral. At the top, a single pinnacone balanced perfectly on its tip. No animal could have built it. No wind could have sculpted it overnight. Jenny stepped beside me, arms wrapped tight around her chest. Her breath clouded the morning air. It left us a monument, she said, the word trembling. "We're leaving," I told her, voice hoarse. Now, we packed with frantic precision water, protein bars, first aid kit, the bear spray, and nothing else. The rest our clothes, cameras, even our wedding rings locked in the tiny RV safe we abandoned without a backward glance. The forest felt awake and watchful as we stepped onto the frost-crusted road. Every sound along the trail wore meaning. Branches cracked far off, too heavy for deer. Shadows slid between trunks like dark water. We spoke only in gestures, conserving breath and silence alike. By late morning, we'd covered perhaps 6 miles. My watch said noon, but under the towering pines it was dusk again, the canopy swallowing the sun. Once, as we crossed a narrow footbridge over a frozen creek, the boards shuddered behind us, though neither of us had stepped back. Jenny spun, eyes wide. Nothing stood there, only the forest knitting itself tighter. Hours later, the woods finally thinned. A weak sun bled across the asphalt of the park's access road, like a promise we barely believed. We reached the highway just as daylight drained to blue. My legs trembled with each step, not from distance, but from the sense that the trees ended only because something allowed them to. A long-haul truck braked when we flagged it down. The driver, a bearded man in a John Deere cap, didn't ask questions. He just opened the cab and pointed to the thermos on his dashboard. Coffee steam curled into the cab like forgiveness. From that moment, the world resumed its familiar noises. Engine growl, radio static, the dry chatter of roadside gravel. But the silence we'd left behind rode with us, an invisible passenger that smelled faintly of wet stone. We never called the park rangers. We told the insurance company. Our sedan had been destroyed by a falling tree and vandals had stripped the RV. They believed us. People believe the smallest story that keeps their world intact. Jenny stopped hiking. I stopped looking at stars. At night, we both listened for that low-coded knock 3, pause, 2, pause, one that sometimes hides inside the clatter of city pipes or the elevator's descent. And every New Year's Eve, when fireworks bloom over Austin, I feel the same cold weight that slid across the clearing after our last rocket burst, the sense that something ancient and calculating is aware of our celebration. I used to think survival was victory. Now I know it's a contract signed in a language I'll never read. We walked away because it allowed us to. Whatever dwells in those pines didn't just spare us, it marked us. And every quiet night since, I wonder when it will collect. The first weeks back in Austin felt like waking from a nightmare while the dream kept breathing beside the bed. I returned to work because spreadsheets were easier to face than silence, but the office lights seemed too bright, like they were trying to bleach away something that couldn't be scrubbed. Jenny floated through our penthouse in long, careful steps, as though sudden movement might draw the forest closer. We barely spoke of what happened. When we tried, words bent and cracked under their own weight. At night, the city hummed with traffic and neon, yet I kept hearing that low knock 3. Pause 2, pause 1 inside the plumbing, the elevator shaft, even the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Sometimes I'd jolt awake certain that the room was tilting, the way the RV had when those first blows landed. Jenny slept in short bursts, always with a lamp on, her dreams snagging her into sudden breathless wakes. We pretended to be fine for friends, for colleagues, but the air between us stayed brittle. One evening in late February, the doorman mentioned a delivery, a plain cardboard box left at the front desk with no return address. Inside was a single pinnacone, perfectly balanced on a spiral of smooth gray stones. No note, no fingerprints. The same arrangement we'd found in the clearing. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That the woods mailed us a souvenir? From that night forward, small intrusions multiplied shadows pooling where light should reach, a faint metallic smell drifting through the vents. Once, in the reflection of a darkened window, I thought I saw a tall figure step out of the glass itself. When I turned, the balcony was empty, but the railing still trembled as if something heavy had leaned there. Jenny began taping the peephole and wedging a chair under the door handle before bed. She stopped laughing entirely. I caught her more than once staring at the horizon beyond the city, eyes locked on the faint silhouette of distant pine ridges, as if she could feel a pulse beating in the hills. We tried therapy. The counselor used words like trauma response and shared delusion. I nodded, but inside I knew we hadn't imagined anything. There are moments a mind cannot invent, the weight of an unseen hand turning cold metal under your palm, the taste of soil that doesn't belong in the air, the conscious pause of something deciding whether you live. March bled into April. Work trips came and went. But each time I checked into a hotel, I positioned the bed away from windows and listened for that impossible pattern in the air conditioner's rattle. Every distant knock carried a question I couldn't unhear. On a damp evening in early May, while walking home, I passed a construction site and froze. In the wet concrete of the sidewalk lay a single enormous print human in shape, but far too large, ridges of what looked like fingerprints pressed into the sole. Rain should have blurred it, but it held its edges with uncanny precision. No one else on the street seemed to notice. That night I dreamed, or maybe remembered, our final moments in the forest. The image replayed with brutal clarity, the door closing on its own, the coded knocks, the slow withdrawal of that impossible hand. But this time, in the dream, I sensed a message rather than a threat. Not mercy, recognition. I woke before dawn to find the pinnacone from the mysterious box balanced on the bedroom windowsill, though I'd locked it inside a drawer weeks earlier. The city below lay quiet, cars like distant embers. I didn't wake Jenny. I simply stood there, staring at the silent token, and understood that whatever watched us in those woods hadn't stayed behind. We sought the wilderness for peace and returned with an awareness that civilization is only a fragile veil. Somewhere beyond our glass towers, something vast and patient walks the earth, and sometimes it follows you home, not to kill, but to remind you who really owns the dark.